Hi everyone, it's Amy here from the blog I Think Therefore I Teach. Welcome to your next support video for Religious Studies Exam 2022. This video is going to go through all the past exam questions that have come up that are in the same topics that the exam board has specified, plus any obvious gaps that have not been asked before. This way you can see whether you could have answered previous questions and then prepare for where the gaps are as well as part of your revision. Right, let's get going. So, RS Past Questions Exam 2022. We'll start with philosophy then. So, the AS questions, this is the first year questions that have been asked previously. Plato, to what extent does Plato's views of the forms explain the nature of reality? Aristotle, critically discuss Aristotle's understanding of reality. Teleological, Aquinas' fifth way does not demonstrate the existence of God. Cosmological, to what extent does Aquinas' cosmological argument successfully reach the conclusion that there is a transcendent creator, and evaluate Aquinas' cosmological argument for God's existence? Finally, problem of evil, assess the claim that natural evil has a purpose, critically discuss the theodicy of Augustine, and Augustine's interpretation of the fall successfully explains the problem of evil. You've also got the years in which they were present in the exam. What you can notice is some of the wording is quite similar to what extent, or evaluate, or assess, critically discuss. So they're all wanting to emphasise the evaluation that is necessary in your answer. The A-level questions for Plato evaluate Plato's view of the hierarchy of forms, including the form of good. Aristotle, analyse Aristotle's four causes. Teleological, the world was created by chance, not by God's design. Paley's teleological argument successfully defends the existence of God. To what extent does Hume successfully argue that observation does not prove the existence of God? Because it's Hume, it could either be teleological or cosmological, and a student can write about both in that answer and be awarded and credited marks. Problem of evil, critically compare the logical and evidential aspects of the problem of evil as challenges to belief. And finally, nature of God, assess Boethius' view that divine eternity does not limit human free will. My advice would be to go through these questions. You'll also find them on the blog as well. Go through these questions. What would you put? Plan your answers. How would you make sure that you answer that question specifically? What would your line of argument be? What would you actually argue? There is also, today I've just done a recent blog on examiners, the exam report comments. So you can also see now with these questions what the examiners actually said. So which areas students did right and wrong, the gaps that were missed, etc. Talking of gaps then, these are the obvious gaps as far as the questions that have been asked and the areas on the spec that have not been asked. Now, you do whatever you want with these gaps. I'm just pointing out what they are. Within Plato then, Plato's understanding of reality and Plato's reliance on reason as opposed to the senses, the analogy of the cave specifically has not been asked. Aristotle's use of teleology and the prime mover and its connections between this and the final cause have not been asked. Comparison and evaluation of Plato's form of the good and Aristotle's prime mover. Comparison and evaluation of Plato's reliance on reason and Aristotle's use of senses in their attempts to make sense of reality. And challenge of evolution, which could be teleological or cosmological. And then Hume's criticisms for the existence of God from natural religion, specifically against cosmological. So we got it against teleological, but never specifically against cosmological. Fairness, let's go back. Hume's never specifically been asked for either, so you might get one specific to cosmological or specific to teleological. Now, the ones in bold are, for me, the obvious questions they might ask. This is purely my opinion. This is just purely the feelings that I get as far as if I was going to write questions. They seem to make very, very good questions. The first one is understanding Plato's reliance on reason as opposed to senses. For me, If you're going to get a question on Plato, I doubt very much you'll get an analogy of the cave. Why? Because on the previous spec, when that one came up, nearly most of the country wrote an analogy of the cave, and it was just so tedious for the markers. Doesn't mean it won't be there, but for me, a question on Plato's reliance on reason opposed to senses means that you can get a lot of good Aristotle in there as well to compare. So for me, that seems like a really good possible question. The next big gap for me that I notice is the prime mover. Aristotle's prime mover has not been asked. That's an easy question to ask. It's a good one for students of all levels to be able to answer. The prime mover for me is an obvious one. A comparison and evaluation between Plato and Aristotle. Again, compare questions are very challenging. Make sure you are prepared with your right language and structure as far as how you would answer a question like that. But a comparison between Plato and Aristotle actually then makes two very easy topics. Plato and Aristotle are easy. Easy topics are a lot harder and a lot more challenging. For me as an examiner, that would be far more where I'd be going down, is a comparison route. And then the other one that stands out to me is evolution. Evolution's never been mentioned. It's specified very, very clearly on the spec in both teleological and cosmological, and it's never been asked for before. I think a question on evolution, very much like the Hume question, but evolution against the the observations and God's existence, seems a really good one. I would be very prepared to talk about evolution. I would research evolution. I would know evolution. Further obvious gaps. These are for the problem of evil. Whether or not it's possible to successfully defend monotheism in the face of evil. Hick's reworking of the Irenaean theodicy, which gives some purpose to natural evil and enabling human beings to reach divine likeness. Whether or not the need to create a veil of soul-making can justify the existence or extent of evils. And then finally, there is a huge area of nature of God that has not been asked. Nature of God's only been asked once, so hence why there's a lot of areas of spec that have not been asked. You have omnipotence that's missing, omniscience and omnibenevolence. You have Anselm's force specifically. You have one on Boethius, Anselm or Swinburne, specifically on divinity and time, so that's eternal. You have thinkers resolving the problems on divine knowledge, benevolence, justice, eternity or human free will. They might ask a specific one of those areas. Or whether the attribute should be understood as subject to the limits of logical possibility or of divine self-limitation. That, of course, is again about omnipotence. So when it comes to problem of evil and nature of God, the massive gap for problem of evil is John Hick. John Hick's work. That for me seems a perfect question. The idea that will test students to make sure they know what John Hick actually says, how his arguments actually differ and built upon Irenaeus' theodicy, and then use Augustine as a comparative evaluative argument. So for me, John Hick is the really obvious gap there that would make a very good question. When it comes to nature of God, as you can see, it could be anything. I think nature of God will be there because I think it's challenging. It's a challenging topic and it will really push those A's and those A-star students. As far as the topics, I think if they're going to ask you a nature of God question, they're going to, I would say if I was writing the questions, I would keep it very open. I wouldn't specify someone like Anselm. I think that's just too mean. I would keep it very open. I would do one on omniscience. I would do one on omnipotence. I'd do one on omnibenevolence. I keep it open, and therefore you could then bring in Boethius, Anselm and or Swinburne. So being specific to one of those names means that you narrow the essay down, whereas you keep it open, you have to keep your control, but it also means you have a lot more that you can talk about and discuss. So that would be my instincts as far as philosophy questions and gaps. As I said before, that is purely my interpretation. You need to be prepared for any question, so you need to revise all the topics thoroughly. You need to make sure you understand the specification wording which you can see on these slides. So you need to know what temporal existence means. You need to know what divine foreknowledge is and who argues it. You need to know about divine foreknowledge and justice. You need to make, a veil of soul making. You need to make sure you know what these words mean because they can quite easily put them into an exam. What examiners often do as well is they're using the spec, using the specification and where all this is worded. You can get all of this on OCR website under religious studies, so you can access all of this. Normally what they do is they just remove the bullet point and put to what extent critically assess, critically discuss, analyse. So to what extent does Hick's reworking of the Irenaean theodicy give us an understanding of the purpose of natural evil? I've just reworded the second bullet point there into a question. And so it's right there, the wording is right there, you just add in to an extent beforehand. Ethics then. Euthanasia obviously is the only area from AS ethics that has been specified, and so therefore you get questions like, to what extent does natural law provide a helpful method of moral decision making? Voluntary euthanasia is always morally acceptable. To what extent is natural law too reliant on telos in making moral decisions? And assess the view that non-voluntary euthanasia is morally unacceptable. Now, I very much doubt that you will get a specific question like the first and third bullet point. I very much doubt, because they have only said euthanasia. They will not ask you specifically on natural law or situations. They might. You have to be prepared for that. But because they haven't added that, they might just be assuming that you will. But because they have not added it, I think the question might be more generalised. You will be expected to still talk about natural law and situation ethics in your answer, but I think it'll be far more a question like the voluntary euthanasia or the non-voluntary euthanasia question. A-level questions, euthanasia. Assess the view that natural law is of no help with regard to the issue of euthanasia. Meta-ethics. Good is meaningful. Discuss. The terms good, bad, right and wrong reflect only what is in the mind, should be of the person using them. Good is best explained by emotivism. Conscience. Evaluate Aquinas' theological approach to conscience. To what extent is Freud's psychological approach to conscience the most helpful approach? And finally, sex ethics. Natural law provides the best approach. They love natural law, don't they? And situation ethics provides the best approach to sexual ethics. So those are the questions that have been asked previously over both first and second year. Again, could you answer them? Could you answer them? What would you write? What would your line of argument be? Is good meaningful or not? Yes or no? How would you go about it? You know, are you Team Aquinas' conscience or not? How would you go about it? What then are the obvious gaps? First of all, within euthanasia, sanctity of life, quality of life, whether or not the religious concept of sanctity of life has any meaning in the 21st century medical ethics, whether or not a person should or can have complete autonomy over their own life and decisions made about it, whether or not there is a moral difference between medical intervention to end a patient's life, so that would be active euthanasia, and medical non-intervention, so where they don't intervene, maybe remove something more passive to end a patient's life. So is there a moral difference between those active and passive euthanasia? Within meta-ethics, ethical naturalism, whether or not what is meant by the word good is defining question in the study of ethics, whether or not ethical terms such as good, bad, right and wrong have an objective, factual basis that makes them true or false in describing something, whether or not from a common sense approach people just know within themselves what is good, bad, right and wrong. Again, for me, for euthanasia, the obvious gaps and the obvious possible questions around sanctity of life or quality of life. They just scream easy questions to ask you. It means that you can bring in natural law or situation ethics. It means that you don't have to bring them in if you don't want to, and you can discuss them fully. You could get potentially one on sanctity versus quality, but I think they are your big gaps within euthanasia. Within meta-ethics, I think the big gap is ethical naturalism. Ethical naturalism has not been asked. It could be asked in the idea of, like the third yellow one, right and wrong have objective factual basis. That means that you'll be talking about ethical naturalism and intuitionism, but the others have been specified in previous questions. Ethical naturalism has not. So for me, that's the area of meta-ethics that's not being asked. It could still be on emotivism, it could still be an intuitionism, but that's the gap that is there. Examiners know this though. Examiners know we can spot the gaps, so therefore it has been known by OCR many a time that they throw a complete curveball in there. So you need to be prepared and ready for anything. Obvious gaps with conscience. Comparison between Aquinas and Freud and the concept of guilt. Comparison between Aquinas and Freud and the presence or absence of God within the workings of the conscience and superego. Comparison between Aquinas and Freud and the process of moral decision making, whether conscience is linked to or separate from reason and the unconscious mind, whether conscience exists at all or is instead an umbrella term covering various factors involved in moral decision making such as culture, environment, genetic predisposition and education. Finally, sex ethics, specifically a question on premarital, extramarital or homosexuality. Traditional religious beliefs and practices from any religious perspective regarding these areas of sexual ethics, how these beliefs and practices have changed over time, including key teachings influencing these beliefs and practices, ideas of religious figures and institutions, or the impact of secularism on these areas of sexual ethics, specifically Kant or utilitarianism, whether or not religious beliefs and practices concerning sex and relationships have a continuing role in sexual ethics, and finally, whether choices in the area of sexual behaviour should be entirely private and personal, or whether they should be subject to societal norms and legislation. So the obvious gaps and the obvious possible questions for me is a comparison question. 1, 2, 3 areas of the spec mention comparison between Aquinas and Freud. It's never been asked before. So again, knowing your comparison techniques, knowing how to do a compare question properly. I'm happy to do a video if it will help people. Just let me know in the comments. So this idea of a comparison between Aquinas and Freud seems to be the big obvious one jumping out. As far as sex ethics, for me, if I was writing a question, I would do one specifically on premarital, extramarital or homosexuality. Why? Because again, the exam board specified sex ethics. It means you need to revise your 4 ethics because you can't really answer any question on those without knowing your 4 normative ethics, your natural law, your Kant, etc. But I don't think they will ask you a specific question on Kant or utilitarianism. I might be wrong, but I don't think they will. I think they will do a sweeping question covering homosexuality, for example, a sweeping one on premarital sex, in which you can then bring in any argument, any of the 4 ethical theories that you would like. Finally, Christian thought, the AS questions. Knowledge of God. To what extent is faith the only means of knowing God? Evaluate the claim that human knowledge of God's existence is innate. Person of Jesus. Jesus' teaching was only about becoming a moral person. Jesus' miracles demonstrate that he was the Son of God. Finally, moral action. To what extent was Dietrich Bonhoeffer justified in his teachings on civil disobedience? Assess the view that Bonhoeffer's theology puts too much emphasis on suffering, and assess the view that Bonhoeffer's community at Finkenwald is a useful example for Christian communities. A-level questions and knowledge of God. Humans have an innate knowledge of God. So very similar to, 2019, that one was asked, very similar to the first year 2020 question. Evaluate the view that God cannot be known from creation. Just going back to that, it just shows that they are happy to repeat areas, so you could get any area repeated again. Just because it's already been mentioned in a previous exam does not mean you might not get it again. That one was evaluate the view that God cannot be known from creation. Person Jesus, to what extent was Jesus merely a political liberator? Love the word merely. So much discussion you could make there on the word merely. Moral action. Bonhoeffer's theology is still relevant today. Good question. And gender and theology. Assess the view that Mary Daly's theology proves that Christianity is sexist. So these are your previous questions that have been asked so far. The gaps then. For knowledge of God, natural and revealed theology, reveal knowledge of God in Jesus Christ and through the life of the church and the Bible, whether or not God can be known through reason alone, whether or not the fall has completely removed all natural human knowledge of God, whether or not natural knowledge of God is the same as revealed knowledge of God, whether or not belief in God's existence is sufficient to put one's trust in him. Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus' divinity as expressed in his knowledge of God or resurrection with reference to Mark and John. A teacher of wisdom, Jesus' moral teachings on repentance, forgiveness, inner purity and moral motivation with reference to Matthew and Luke. Whether or not Jesus was only a teacher of wisdom. Whether or not Jesus' relationship with God was very special or truly unique. Whether or not Jesus thought he was divine. Now, you will notice none of that is bold. Why? I have no idea what they would ask from that. There is an abundance of questions and none of them jumps out to me as easy, obvious questions. There's a lot you could get asked there. When it comes to nature of God, natural revealed knowledge of God, the questions that have been up in the previous years have always surprised me. I think they've always, would be challenging to get going, but once you get in there, remember the topic, that you could really run with them, which means it could really be any of those. You might get asked about reason, you might get asked about the fall, you might get asked about knowledge, natural versus revealed. For me, that would be the nicest one, a natural versus revealed. That's just all of your topic, comparing it, criticising it. That's a good question, but it could be any of them, and anything that previously been asked as well. Person of Jesus, again, these questions are great. I love person of Jesus questions. You can really show a lot of understanding, but it could be any of those. It could be on the divine nature specifically. It was only linked to miracles in the previous one. It could be on teacher of wisdom. Just be aware that it says was only a teacher. So what else was he? Was he only a teacher of wisdom, or did he do more than that? You could get something that says in a question with reference to Matthew and Luke, critically assess Jesus' moral teachings on repentance. That could be made into a question. You might get one asked about God, Jesus being the Son of God and his divinity. So I'm not much help when it comes to those questions, because it could be any of them. Further obvious gaps when it comes to Bonhoeffer. There's so many Bonhoeffer questions that's been asked previously, therefore we have limited gaps for that one. Bonhoeffer's duty to God and duty to the state. Bonhoeffer's teachings on the relationship of the church and the state, including obedience, leadership and doing God's will, or the church's community and source of spiritual discipline. Cost of discipleship. Bonhoeffer's teaching on ethics as action, including costly grace or solidarity. Finally, there has only been one question on sex, gender and theology, so it really could be any of these. Rosemary Radford Ruether on gender and its implications for the Christian idea of God. Ruether's discussion of the maleness of Christ and its implications for salvation, including Jesus' challenge to the male warrior Messiah expectation, God as the female wisdom principle, or Jesus as the incarnation of wisdom. A comparison between Ruether and Daly's feminist theologies on sexism and patriarchy in Christianity as it has developed in the mainstream churches. A comparison of Ruether and Daly's feminist theologies on whether Christianity can be changed or should be abandoned, whether or not Christianity is essentially sexist, whether or not male saviour can save women, whether or not only women can develop a genuine spirituality, and whether or not the Christian church can be presented in female terms. Now again, when it comes to Bonhoeffer, it really could be any of those areas. Cost of discipleship does stand out. However, one thing that I have learned from reading the examiners' reports from previous years, students seem to get costly grace mixed up. Examiners don't really like how students explain costly grace, and so they might ask something specific on costly grace. What I would say is make sure you know Bonhoeffer, make sure you do your research on him. He's a fascinating individual. Make sure you know, you don't just learn the textbook or the PowerPoint as far as these key words. Really know them, submerge yourself within these ideas and do some wider research before you face Bonhoeffer in the exam. When it comes to gender and theology, Rosemary Radford Ruether for me is the obvious gap. Daly's already been asked. I think it's going to be specific on Ruether. Whether it says something like female terms, male saviour, or they do something specific like the male warrior Messiah expectation to make sure that you know that it's Ruether that argues those things, they might do. I'm not so convinced they'll be specific. I think they'll just give you Ruether and you run with Ruether, it's a mouthful, as much as you want to. I don't think they're going to specify a certain area of her argument. I might be wrong. The other question that stands out for me is, of course, Christianity is essentially sexist. This means that you can talk about Ruether and or Daly, or Daly and or Ruether. So that one does stand out for me. The other one that would be a really good question is whether it should be changed or abandoned. Change is obviously Ruether. Ruth thinks it can be changed and the original meaning's brought back, whereas Daly says abandon it, get rid of it, Christianity no more. So that again would make a good question. My gut is telling me, though, that it's not going to be a compare question. My gut is telling me that you are not going to get a question that wants both Ruether and Daly, because that is just a huge minefield of work. I mean, I've done 2 PowerPoints for them because there's so much Daly. I mean, I talk a lot. Daly talks a lot. So I think anything on both of them, it's just too much for 40 minutes. If you do get one on both of them, keep it very structured, very specific, and don't go down tangents. Keep your themes really clear. So make sure you kind of tick a couple of big themes for each woman and then compare them. You don't have time to write the whole lot of their arguments. The essentially sexist means that you can bring in either of them, as I've said, and then that gives you that freedom of choice. But I would say no Ruther and no Ruther well. All right, folks, I hope you found that useful. Please give me a thumbs up if you did. Don't forget to put any comments underneath if you do have any, and I'll do try and reply. And subscribe as well so that you don't miss out on any of the updates coming up to your exams in summer. Don't forget as well to check out the blog that I've done today on examiners' reports so that you know the gaps and the mistakes done previously so you don't make them again. Right, thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now.